I've been a long time lurker on this sub, but I've never posted before. I'm a private investigator based out of the Pacific Northwest, mostly dealing with insurance fraud and infidelity, but occasionally, I get hired to look into cold cases. I know the true crime community loves a good unresolved mystery, but I'm sharing this one because it crosses a line into something I still can't rationally explain. Back in 1988, a family of four, the Hendersons, vanished from their remote hunting cabin in the Cascade Mountains. The original police report noted that dinner was still hot on the stove, their car was in the driveway with the keys in the ignition, and their winter coats were still hanging by the door. It was the middle of January. There were no footprints in the snow outside of the cabin. The only piece of physical evidence ever recovered was a single bloody child's boot found 3 miles away, suspended high up in the branches of a pine tree. The case went stone cold. 30 years later, the surviving grandmother hired me to take one last look at the files before she passed away. She just wanted closure. I started by requesting the original evidence boxes from the county sheriff's department. Because so much time had passed, they were surprisingly willing to let a licensed PI review the non-sensitive materials. Inside the box was a standard microcassette recorder. The police log said it was found on the kitchen table of the cabin, but the tape inside was completely blank when they played it back in '88. I don't know why, maybe it was a gut feeling, but I decided to buy an old dictaphone off eBay and play the tape myself. At first, it was just the expected tape hiss, but about 10 minutes in, the hiss started to change. It sounded like something breathing, but the lung capacity was completely wrong. It was a single, unbroken inhale that lasted for almost 4 minutes. Then came the voices. It was the Henderson family. But they weren't screaming or asking for help. They were casually discussing the weather, but the audio was playing in reverse. Mixed beneath their reversed voices was a low, resonant hum that physically vibrated the glass of water on my desk. I took the tape to an audio forensic buddy of mine. He ran it through a spectrogram and he went dead pale. The visual representation of the sound waves didn't look like normal peaks and valleys. The sound waves were forming distinct, repeating geometric patterns, like perfect mandalas. He told me the frequencies required to make those shapes organically shouldn't be possible for a human vocal cord. Against my better judgment, I decided to drive up to the old Henderson cabin. It had been abandoned for decades, property of the state now, slowly rotting back into the forest. The drive took me 2 hours deep into the logging roads. When I parked and hiked the remaining half-mile, the woods were dead silent. I don't mean quiet, I mean absolutely devoid of sound. No birds, no wind, no crunching of pine needles under my boots. It felt like I was walking through a vacuum. The cabin itself was partially collapsed, the roof caved in by years of heavy snow. As I stepped through the rotted front door frame, my digital watch started beeping frantically before the LCD screen bled completely black. I pulled out my digital camera to document the scene, but the battery was entirely drained. That's when I noticed the smell. It wasn't the smell of old wood or rot. It was the sharp, metallic tang of ozone, like the air right after a massive lightning strike. I walked into what used to be the kitchen. The linoleum was peeled up, and the walls were covered in decades of grime, but perfectly centered on the rotting table was a fresh, steaming cup of coffee. The heat was radiating off it in the freezing mountain air. I froze, my hand instinctively dropping to my concealed carry. I called out, announcing myself, but there was no response. Then, from the corner of the ceiling, not the floor, the ceiling, I heard the exact same reversed voices I had heard on the tape. It sounded like the mother, speaking backward, her voice echoing as if she were in a massive cavern instead of a small, cramped cabin. I looked up. Clinging to the shadows in the rafters was a figure that was entirely too long. Its limbs were stretched out, spider-like, pinning itself into the corner of the ceiling. It didn't have a face, just a smooth, pale surface where features should be. It wasn't wearing clothes. Its skin looked like the bark of a birch tree. As I watched, paralyzed, the thing slowly rotated its head towards me, and the reverse speaking stopped. Suddenly, the continuous, impossible 4-minute inhale from the tape started echoing through the room. The temperature plummeted so fast I could see my breath crystallizing in the air. I didn't stick around to figure out what it was. I backed out of the cabin, never taking my eyes off the ceiling, and the moment my foot touched the soil outside, the absolute silence of the woods broke. The birds returned, the wind howled, and I sprinted back to my truck. I drove back to the city in complete silence. I refunded the grandmother her money and told her the evidence box was a dead end. I couldn't tell her that I think her family walked into something ancient and wrong out in those woods. The cold case remains unsolved, and I refuse to take jobs involving the Cascade Mountain Range anymore. For the last 10 years, I worked out of the Rust Belt, taking on a lot of missing persons cases in economically depressed industrial towns. There's a famous local urban legend in our area called the Copper Wire Killings. Back in 2004, 3 urban explorers and scrap metal scavengers broke into the decommissioned Hemlock Steel Mill. 3 days later, a security guard doing a perimeter check found their bodies. The police report stated they had been crushed to death by a massive industrial stamping press. The true crime aspect comes from the fact that the police treated it as a triple homicide. Why? Because the Hemlock Mill had its power grid completely severed in 1978. There was no electricity running to that machine, no generators on site, and the press weighed over 40 tons. Someone, or some group of people, would have had to manually lift a 40-ton press and drop it on those kids. No arrests were ever made, and it became a local cold case, heavily discussed on forums just like this one. A few months ago, an independent true crime documentary crew hired me to do some physical reconnaissance of the mill. They wanted to film an episode there, but needed a licensed PI to verify the site's safety, check for squatters, and cross-reference the layout with the 2004 police photographs. I agreed, took my advance, and drove out to the industrial park. The Hemlock Mill is a hulking, rusted cathedral of steel and shattered glass. Walking inside felt like stepping into the belly of a dead whale. The air was thick with the taste of rust and asbestos. I had my heavy-duty flashlight, a crowbar, and a body cam strapped to my chest to record the layout for the film crew. I spent the first hour mapping the ground floor, checking the structural integrity. Everything matched the old police files perfectly. But things started getting weird when I reached the sector where the stamping presses were located. As I walked down the main corridor, surrounded by towering, silent machinery, I realized my flashlight beam wasn't behaving normally. When I shined it against the far wall, my shadow wasn't trailing behind me. It was projected onto the wall, but it was lagging. If I raised my arm, my shadow would wait a full 2 seconds before raising its arm. I stopped dead in my tracks, waving my hands, watching this impossible delay. I tried to rationalize it as a trick of the dust or the curved metal surfaces, but my gut was screaming at me. Then I looked down at the floor. The dust here was inches thick, untouched for nearly 20 years. But forming right in front of me, about 10 feet away, were fresh footprints. They were the distinct tread of heavy work boots, pressing deep into the grime. I watched them appear, step by step, walking parallel to me, but there was absolutely no one there. The invisible steps paced me all the way to the room housing the stamping press where the kids died. I stood in the doorway of the press room, my heart hammering against my ribs. The massive iron press was rusted shut, exactly as it had appeared in the crime scene photos. But as I raised my flashlight to inspect the gears, a deafening sound shattered the silence. It was the shriek of grinding, unlubricated metal. The 40-ton press began to rise. There were no lights, no hum of electricity, just the agonizing groan of iron scraping against iron. It lifted about 10 feet into the air and locked into place. The floor beneath it, where the victims had been found, was coated in a fresh, glistening layer of dark red fluid. I took a step back and suddenly, the temperature in the room skyrocketed. It felt like I was standing in front of an open blast furnace. From the shadows behind the press, a shape began to emerge. It looked like a man wearing a 1970s steelworker's uniform, but his body was impossibly mangled. His torso was flattened to the thickness of a piece of cardboard, yet he was standing upright, moving with a horrifying, jerky gait. His face was just a wide, dark smear. The entity pointed a 2-dimensional crushed finger at me, and every single machine in the entire factory suddenly roared to life. Conveyor belts started spinning, chains rattled from the ceiling, and the deafening cacophony of a fully operational steel mill filled the air, all completely devoid of electricity. I turned and ran. I sprinted blindly through the labyrinth of rusted metal, the sound of heavy, delayed footsteps right behind me the entire way. I didn't stop until I burst through the rusted exterior doors and tumbled down the concrete steps into the daylight. The moment I was outside, the roaring machinery went dead silent. I threw the body cam into my trunk and sped off. When I finally plugged the body cam into my computer to show the documentary crew why I was breaching my contract, the footage was perfectly clear. It showed me walking through the factory, shining my light, but there was no lagging shadow. There were no invisible footprints. The stamping press never moved. I just stood in an empty room, screamed at nothing, and ran away. But I know what I saw, and I know what I heard. I sent the crew their deposit back and closed my PI agency the next day. The true crime podcasters can keep their mysteries. I don't know if this belongs here, but I need to put this out there into the world before I lose my mind. I'm a private investigator down in Louisiana, mostly working the parishes surrounding New Orleans. The swamps hide a lot of secrets, and over my 20-year career, I've pulled more than a few runaway teens and stolen cars out of the bayous. This story involves a cold case from 1974. A wealthy socialite named Clarice Vance rented a riverboat for a massive, lavish party. Sometime around midnight, she simply vanished. The boat was searched top to bottom. The river was dragged for miles, but no trace of Clarice was ever found. The police assumed she fell overboard and drowned, swept away by the Mississippi currents. Her wealthy husband was a suspect for a while, but he had an airtight alibi. Fast forward to last year. A group of surveyors mapping a dense, landlocked section of the Blackwood Swamp, at least 50 miles away from where the riverboat was, found a muddy lockbox. Inside was Clarice Vance's diamond engagement ring and a pearl necklace she was wearing the night she disappeared. The estate lawyer hired me to take an airboat out to the survey coordinates and see if there was any sign of her remains. I hired a local guide to take me deep into the Blackwood. The swamp out there is thick, ancient, and feels completely cut off from the rest of the world. Spanish moss hangs down like heavy drapes, and the water is the color of black tea. When we finally reached the coordinates, my guide refused to cut the engine. He told me the area had a bad reputation, a place where the Cajuns said the river people took their offerings. I thought it was just local superstition, so I paid him extra to wait a while I waded into the waist-deep muck. The surveyors had marked the tree where they found the lockbox with neon orange tape. As I approached the tree, I noticed the water around me was unnaturally still. No mosquitoes, no frogs, no gators. Just a heavy, suffocating humidity. Behind the marked tree, partially concealed by massive roots and thick vines, was a shack built on stilts. It wasn't on any county map. It looked like it had been constructed entirely out of driftwood and swamp debris. I climbed the rotting wooden ladder and pushed the door open. The inside of the shack was impeccably clean. It smelled like fresh jasmine and expensive perfume, completely masking the stench of the swamp. On a small wooden table in the center of the room sat a leather-bound diary. I opened it, hoping to find some clue about the person who had stashed Clarice's jewelry. The first entry was dated October 12, 1974, the day after she disappeared. It was in Clarice's handwriting. I read through the pages, my dread growing with every word. She didn't write about being kidnapped. She wrote about being chosen. She described how the water had reached up and pulled her from the boat, gently carrying her through underground aquifers to this swamp. But the terrifying part was that the diary entries didn't stop in the 70s. They continued through the 80s, the 90s, all the way up to the present day. The ink on the final entry was still wet. It read, "We have a guest today. The water is so hungry." I slammed the book shut and turned to leave, but the doorway was blocked. Standing on the small porch of the shack was a woman wearing a tattered, mud-stained 1970s evening gown. Her skin was the color of bruised clay, and her hair was plastered to her face with black water. It was Clarice Vance, but she hadn't aged a single day since 1974. She wasn't breathing. Her chest was completely still, and dark swamp water continuously wept from her eyes and mouth. Behind her, slowly rising from the black water of the swamp, were dozens of other figures. Men, women, and children, all covered in mud, all perfectly still, staring up at the shack. Their eyes caught the dim light shining through the canopy, reflecting it back like a deer in headlights. The water level in the swamp began to rise at an impossible rate. surging up the wooden stilts of the shack, bubbling and frothing. I didn't think, I just threw a heavy wooden chair through the back window of the shack and dove head first into the swamp. The water was freezing cold, and as I swam frantically toward the sound of my guide's airboat engine, I felt cold, slimy hands grabbing at my boots. They were pulling me down, trying to drag me under the thick mud. I kicked violently, losing one of my boots in the process, and burst through the surface right next to the airboat. The guide hauled me over the side, his face pale with terror, and gunned the engine. We tore out of the Blackwood swamp, the sound of splashing and gurgling fading behind us. I handed the diary over to the estate lawyer and told him to consider the case closed. Clarice Vance didn't drown in the Mississippi River, but she's never coming back. I haven't been near a body of water since, and I keep my doors locked every time it rains.